On the 12th of March 1913 on Capitol Hill, the ceremony to christen the new city attracted thousands of spectators. A vice-regal affair, with troops marching and guns blazing, enthusiastic reporters filed their stories. On the 14th of March 1913, at the Capitol camp, 2 patients were taken from their 10 by 12 foot tents to Queanbeyan Hospital, suffering from diphtheria. That's life in Canberra, the political and the historic, side by side with the day-to-day story of actually living here. And while political proceedings will be found carefully documented in Hansard, try tracking these down. Going to a Saturday matinee at the Capitol, shopping sprees on payday, or watching the Canberra Day Parade. These events are as much about Canberra as any political affair.
Canberra's calling to you.
When in October 1908 the site was chosen for the Federal Capital Territory, Queanbeyan, Yass and Goulburn were already large towns on the New South Wales map. The new capital lay central to them, on the limestone plains in the Monaro River Valley, where large properties and Indigenous populations resided. The future capital city, located in the north of the FCT, was nameless and awaited the results of a competition to come up with something appropriate. There were thousands of entries, and 2 emerged as clear favourites. In his speech, made after Lady Denman had revealed the new name, Prime Minister Andrew Fisher spoke about the choices.
A striking suggestion concerning the chief city of Australia was a name difficult to pronounce, Sid Mel Ed Per Briz Ho, combining some part of the name of every state capital. Another suggestion that had many friends was Mayola, until some ingenious person discovered that by transposing the letters it bore a close resemblance to the distinguished patronymic of the Minister for Home Affairs. However, the choice of the government has eventually fallen on Canberra, and I believe that it is a name which will commend itself to the good sense of the community.
The name Canberra was taken from the name of a local property. As early as 1823, Joshua John Moore began to build his farm settlement on a land grant in a curve of the Monaro River. He named it Canberry. 20 years later, Lieutenant Arthur Jeffreys, the new owner, renamed it Acton. In 1910, Acton was the first private holding to become Commonwealth property. The name stuck, and Acton it has remained. Between 1908 and 1927, development and decisions about the capital were slow and controversial. The Australian taxpayers were reluctant to accept the creation of a capital, perceiving it as a financial burden. Politicians, fearful of losing their seats through voter dissatisfaction, reflected this hostile attitude in every issue that the capital project raised. So tenuous was the situation, when the first sod for Parliament House was turned on the 28th of August 1923, that when workmen asked that Sod Day be turned into a public holiday, the Minister for Trades and Customs, Sir Austin Chapman, gave an exasperated response. "For heaven's sake, men, stay quiet," it's reported he said. "If you only knew how I have to invent all kinds of schemes to get money to keep the work going, you wouldn't ask. How can I ask for money for a holiday and at the same time ask for money to find employment for men?" Walter Burley Griffin and Marion Mahoney, the winners of the international competition for the design of the capital in 1912, arrived in Melbourne in late 1913 to oversee the design and construction of their city. They were unaware that Cabinet had ratified another design layout presented by the departmental board. From this followed 7 years of arguments. Despite all its detractors, the Griffin plan is the backbone of Canberra's layout. While there has been some divergence, the crucial elements are in place. Griffin ensured this by insisting that Commonwealth Avenue be constructed first, the fundamental key to his land and water access design, and which he oversaw personally. As the capital progressed, gradually local properties were resumed. Duntroon had handed over a 370-acre lease to the nation for the Royal Military College in November 1910. The college, which opened in 1911, would encompass many of Duntroon's buildings, including the main house, which became the officers' mess. For the next 3 years, many trainees were inducted, and at the start of the First World War, they went off to the trenches. The Depression saw the college move to Victoria Barracks in Sydney as a money-saving initiative. It returned in 1937. In the intervening years, the property housed many other residents, including Richard Casey and his family. During his term as Federal Treasurer, he lived in M Quarters at Duntroon. But after much political procrastination, in 1919 the deadline was set. From 1924, the seat of federal government would move from Melbourne to Canberra. The first cabinet sitting would be on the 30th of January 1924, with the opening of Parliament House pencilled in for 1926. Locals remained sceptical to the last. The interim seat of federal parliament would be Yarralumla Homestead. At this stage in 1919, Yarralumla, purchased from Frederick Campbell in 1913, was a boarding house for high-level officials and government members. Of the several original homesteads available, only Yarralumla was considered to be of a standard suitable to house a government. In 1925 to 1926, refurbishment and alterations made this glorious building the home of the Governor-General from 1927 and has remained the residence of the Governor-General for over 75 years. In this time, it's been the scene of many public garden parties and open days. It's even been a great backdrop for a pop song. Take it away, little Patty.
I've been hearing tales about you people saying you're an evil runaround guy. I don't think the tales are true, but if they are, then when you come to say goodbye, please let me down lightly, ease it up slightly, let me down lightly.
Amongst these public and behind-the-scenes machinations, the local way of life was already forming as the tent camp sprang up, bringing people from all walks of life together. By the end of 1921, the FCT's population was just 2,583.
Queen Bian,
Initially, the new and isolated community of Canberra was commercially barren. Fortunately, the nearest town, Queanbeyan, at one time to be included in the Federal Capital Territory, was well established. New Territorians flocked across the border to fill their larders, wardrobes, and tool sheds. And every Saturday night, residents from the camps of the Federal Capital Territory would make their way, anywhere they could, to Queanbeyan to drink. Local hotels were pushed to their limit, the crowd so deep at the bar it could take 15 minutes to make your way back for the next one. But why the need to travel to Queanbeyan to get drunk? Canberra began its capital life as a dry town, thanks to prohibitionist King O'Malley, the Minister for Home Affairs. His original vision had included turning the Yarralumla homestead into a temperance hostel for working men. Although dry, Canberra did have hotels and hostels: Brassey House, the Wellington, Beecham House, and the Kurrajong, to name a few, all catering for their customers without being able to offer them a drink. But by far, drink or no drink, the most prestigious was Hostel Number 1. Built close to the proposed Parliament House, it was designed to accommodate members of Parliament and high-level public servants. It was renamed the Hotel Canberra, a more suitable name, by the Federal Capital Commission. Even before it was completed, it opened for business on the 10th of December 1924, only 2 days before the first sale of land in the FCT. Tagged the Hostel Deluxe by members of Melbourne's press, when tenders were called for its management, not one was received. What would be the sense in tendering for a government-owned pub with no beer? The Hotel Canberra had been built to a standard that no other Canberra hotel could match. Hot and cold running water in each room, central heating, a spacious ballroom, lounge, a billiard parlour, and beautiful grounds were just a few of its luxurious features. and by 1931, prohibition having ended in 1928, a bar was added. In 1950, Tui's Limited took out a 25-year lease to run the hotel, and the famous Back Bar was built. With a unique 24-hour licence, it became the centre of Canberra's social scene. Hospitality, of course, wasn't limited to the posh end of town. The new Hotel Civic, opened in August 1936, frowned on the rowdy behaviour of past establishments. Built from a newly developed Canberra brick of a pinkish cream colour, by 1939 it was able to accommodate 66 guests, as well as provide entertainment to Canberrans. The Civic was also a favourite spot for honeymooners. Even when it was the scene of a sit-in, when women protested about men-only saloon bars, it retained the image of being a good country pub. Gutted by fire on Good Friday 1981, it closed its doors 3 years later to make way for greater development. The Hotel Civic had had a long and versatile place in Canberra's community as a venue for conventions and events, including fashion parades.
Mr. Jim Fraser, local member, arrives at the Civic Hotel Canberra for a fashion show by Cara to start Legacy Week. Maybe it is a bit cold yet for this Golden Girl bikini. Nylon straw, the latest in beach hats from the Riviera. A three-piece slack set in shadow striped linen. Everyone in the capital thinks it's capital.
As the capital grew and prospered, so did its hotels. The lakeside pierced the previously low-rise skyline of Civic with its modern tower block, built virtually on the lake shore. With panoramic views, the lakeside became one of Canberra's most sought-after hotels, just behind the Rex in popularity. It hosted many gala nights, including the 1974 banquet given by the Shahanshah and the Shah Banu of Iran. By 1989, as Canberra's public service and tourism industries expanded, hotels catering for a full range of budgets and requirements popped up, while others disappeared. In fact, hotel and hostel living has always been a part of Canberra's identity. Back in the 1920s, the definition of home in Canberra was more likely to mean anything from a shared dormitory to a posh hotel room. As the impressive buildings of the capital went up, more and more workers were required to build them. When Parliament arrived, people were required to service it. But there were no suburbs, no homes to put these people in, the future population of Canberra. As a new arrival, what you would find was not a comfy cottage and definitely not a country pub, but more than likely a tent. The lucky few were moved into the bachelors' quarters at Acton, dormitory-style buildings where at least you had the solace of the snores of your mates to ease the loneliness of the posting. A small part of Braddon, back then called Ainslie, was the first to have permanent and completed government homes in 1926. And by 1927, Gorman House was operating as a hostel for the staff of the Federal Capital Commission, but it is best known for its role as a women's hostel. Each of the pavilions was nicknamed by its residents. The Savages, the Morgue, the Incubator were some, but any of them could be the source for this 1940s story. Apparently, every day when the early morning bus stopped outside, there was a stampede of overnighters back to their own quarters. Such was the wait for homes that even married couples were forced to live in separate dwellings, as the married hostels were always full with long waiting lists. In 1926, when a large intake of public servants was expected, the Federal Capital Commission, set up to oversee the development of Canberra, produced a handbook. In his introduction, Chairman of the FCC, John Butters, apologises for the state of the territory and asked the new arrivals, "Don't grumble more than is humanly possible. Make up your mind to make the best of everything for a little while, and then, when you are settled, come and tell us what we can do to eliminate any troubles you may still have." Of the many complaints received, the lack of fly screens was a big one. The FCC responded with this short film showing what they would do about the fly problem. You can imagine cinema patrons sitting patiently through it wondering where the hell the promised fly screen was. The problem was serious and protective measures had to be taken. By the end of 1926, the suburbs were starting to take shape. the 50 sought-after Oakley and Parkes designed homes in Forest were finished. And by the middle of 1927, another 550 FCC homes were either completed or under construction in Reed, Braddon, Ainslie, Forest, Barton and Eastlake. As Australia struggled through the Depression and the subsequent World War II, government funds were sparse. In 1938, the Federal Capital Territory became the Australian Capital Territory. It didn't ensure more funding, and Canberra's development trickled on over the next 15 years. In this post-war period, the government once again attempted to redress the housing shortage. They commissioned private and government homes. Blocks of flats, once considered potential slums, found new supporters. Approvals were granted, and in 1959, amongst others, Griffith's Stewart Street flats were constructed. Previously, the Bega and Alloa flats were the only flats in Canberra. To maintain the Canberra look, front fences were not encouraged, hedges being preferred. By 1954, there were 145 kilometres of hedges along Canberra streets, and all were expertly clipped courtesy of the Works Department. The homeowner was only required to water them. Behind the hedges, many Canberra homes are made of brick, which until 1975 came from the Yarralumla Brickworks. By 1916, after geological tests proved bricks could be made from local mud, the Commonwealth Brickworks were in business. The aim was to turn out 15 million double-pressed bricks per annum. In an efficient system, the brickworks laid down rail tracks leading from their kilns direct to various work sites. In the 1920s, the average cost to the private builder was £4.16 per 1,000, with an extra £1 per 1,000 for delivery. From 1976, the works closed, and after a brief flirtation as a theme park, and then a successful run as an antique market, it has closed and remains fenced off. But bricks and hedges couldn't battle against 1950s attitudes towards Canberra. People would still resign their jobs rather than move here, and the attitude of the national press didn't help. Fortunately, 3 events spurred the Prime Minister, Robert Menzies, into stirring up support for the city and urgent expansion. Royal protocols demanded by the 1954 Royal Tour highlighted many deficiencies, making the capital unfit for regal receptions. The Cold War was threatening to become a World War III, which meant that relocation of all government departments, especially defence, to one place was desirable. But royalty and world wars pale to insignificance when compared with the needs of family. The Menzies' daughter, Heather, had married in Canberra in 1955 at St Andrew's Church in Forest. After the birth of her first child, Edwina, the plan was to settle here. Her search for a home meant that the new mother and grandmother had to push the pram over potholed dirt tracks, an almost impossible task faced by many. Mother and daughter whinged like mad and prevailed upon the father to do something about it. Unlike other prime ministerial families, the Menzies viewed Canberra as their home, either the lodge or elsewhere. They were part of, and took part in, the community. So Robert Menzies took the pram out and experienced firsthand just how bad it was. From this hands-on survey, the National Capital Development Commission, commonly referred to as the NCDC, emerged. It would be the sole body that would oversee all of Canberra's progress, public and private, for at least the next 30 years. Headed by John Overall, there were big changes ahead. With the legislation, the funds, the power and the total support of the Prime Minister, the NCDC forged ahead from March 1958. First priority was the relocation of the Defence Department, along with the 3 forces. At the top of Kings Avenue, on either side of the Australian-American Memorial, the first of the Russell Office complex was built. Of course, the flow-on from relocation meant that a sudden influx of 4,000 people would be flooding the housing market. Homes were needed, and fast. Dixon, O'Connor, Lynham, Deakin, Campbell, Hackett and Watson were amongst the suburbs where what we now affectionately call the govies went up. The boundaries of Canberra were being pushed, and work on Woden and Belconnen began in the 1960s. Both were conceived as complete townships, with a town centre which would include a shopping centre, commerce and professional offices and leisure areas. Parts of Woden were first to be finished. Although jokingly thought as being out in the sticks, Hughes, or North Cooma as any of these suburbs were nicknamed, was the first of Woden's suburbs to be started and within 12 months had been built. But in February 1964, when the new residents moved in, finished didn't mean completed. No street lights, few telephone lines, and only the occasional bus, which you could be sure wasn't going to go too close to where you were going, drew the community together with a list of common causes to battle. Hughes was officially opened by Doug Anthony, the Minister for the Interior, on the 9th of May 1964. Belconnen was inaugurated in 1966, with 27 suburbs planned around the town centre and Lake Ginninderra. Belconnen was planned for the accommodation of 120,000 residents, with the first moving in 1967. For the first time in Canberra, and as an alternative to flats, townhouses were built. Constructed close to the town centre, it was expected that they would encourage the use of facilities, such as cinemas, taverns, restaurants, and of course the lake. 1973 saw the earth move in readiness for Tuggeranong. Named after the original property where Charles E.W. Bean wrote the first Australian military history, the Tuggeranong Valley is an area full of natural beauty. Using the natural hills and watercourses to define its boundaries, Tuggeranong was conceived as a large country town with low-rise development. Because of its good and plentiful housing, many young families moved in, and it soon earned the nickname Nappy Valley. Today, it stretches as far south as the Lanyon Homestead, one of the ACT's original homesteads, preserved and open to the public. With the advent of the Fraser government, Canberra's planning virtually came to a halt. By the mid-1970s, the Canberra community was one of the most politically aware bunch of people in the country. They began to question the NCDC's plans for Canberra. NCDC staff maintained their humour, producing this Christmas staff home movie, Sending Themselves Up. By the middle of 1988, the Commonwealth Government commissioned the Block Report, which found that the NCDC's job was finished. Canberra was built. Within 6 months, a much smaller body, the National Capital Planning Authority, replaced the original NCDC. The new brief was to oversee the federal capital side of Canberra. 77 years earlier, the first of Canberra's research organisations was founded. Originally conceived in 1905 by the pioneer astronomer Dr. Walter Duffield, Mount Stromlo had been selected as a suitable site for an observatory. With the gift of the Oddie telescope, work could begin, and it did in 1911. One of its earliest tasks was to assist with the surveying of the new capital. In the 1920s, surrounded by pine forests which protected it from bright city lights, the observatory expanded to include more powerful telescopes and a larger research facility. It now began operating as the Commonwealth Solar Observatory, its main work centring on studies of the sun. Under the second director, Richard Woolley, appointed in 1939, the focus changed to the southern stars. Woolley's foresight and ambition for the observatory took Australia to the pinnacle of international astronomy.
It is also a centre of international research and cooperation, as the American Yale-Columbia universities and the old Swedish University of Uppsala have their permanent southern stations there.
Education has been an ever-increasing priority in the life of the city. Even for the smallest children, schooling was provided in its earliest days. In September 1923, Canberra's first new school, Tulopia Park, opened in Barton. The need for formal public education was evident, as the only schools operating were remnants of the late 1800s and could only take small numbers of children. Unintentionally, the new school would become an unusual one, catering at various stages to almost every level of education. To begin with, Tilapia raised educational standards at primary levels, as well as incorporating extracurricular activities like the school band and sports. Within a few years, it gained a kindergarten, and in 1927 it was granted secondary status, filling the gap in education until Canberra High School opened 12 years later. Its students were a familiar sight, waiting to be picked up by the school's own bus service. From the north or south, children could be picked up and dropped practically at their doorsteps, a boon for mothers and little legs that otherwise would have walked the distance. Schools were burgeoning. By the time Canberra High School opened on the 21st of August 1939, there were already several private schools, including the Church of England grammar schools, one for the boys and another for the girls. 11 years earlier, in 1928, St Christopher's Convent School in Martinker had its official opening. The ceremony was attended by Prime Minister Bruce. As a primary school, it was one of many new South Side ones. Later, St Edmunds and St Clair's joined the ranks of Canberra's prestigious private schools. Canberra High provided for up to 1,000 students. Situated to the west of Civic, the splendid white building was surrounded by unfenced green playing fields. Apart from education, the school is also responsible for giving Canberra its first town clock, although you'd need binoculars to see it. The high school closed its doors in 1967. It had simply outgrown its buildings, something they'd been expecting since 1945. The proposed Aranda High School in Belconnen became the new Canberra High School in early 1968. After some refurbishments and new buildings, but still no fence, the Canberra Technical College took the original high school over, and within 5 years it became the Canberra School of Art in 1981. Nestled against Black Mountain, the original high school was in the precinct set aside by Griffin for science and education, virtually across the road from the Institute of Anatomy, which was well established since 1930. The Institute of Anatomy had been set up as a research organisation, and its surrounding grounds were to become an animal sanctuary. Its charter, as stated in the Canberra Annual of 1934, was to be the first visible witness of the destined place of Canberra as the centre of culture and science, to answer the question of whither mankind is headed. Eminent Australians were called upon to speak in its lecture theatre on topics concerning the sciences or the arts. But what really made the Institute a household name was Phar Lap's heart. On display in the exhibition gallery, this famous horse's heart became Canberra's top tourist attraction from 1955 and for many years later. The theatre also provided lecture facilities for the Canberra University College. Based in rooms in Childers Street, Turner, the college, inaugurated in 1929 and affiliated with Melbourne University, had a greater vision for a national university. Their first proposal in 1934 fell on deaf ears and was only realised in the years following World War II. Initially, a research university for postgraduates with 4 schools was planned. These included the John Curtin School for Medical Research, headed by Howard Florey, and the Research School of Physical Sciences, headed by Marcus Oliphant. It would be Oliphant's development of the atom-splitting accelerator, or synchrotron, that really caught the public's imagination. That's right, Jimmy, don't touch. Canberra's education system is unique throughout Australia. It's hard to imagine what it used to be like. Fortunately, Lynham Primary School's Parents and Teachers Association took this film in 1962 to screen to prospective enrolments. Before this, though, Canberra had led the way with after-school care. In post-war Canberra, it wasn't unusual to find both parents working. Play centres were established throughout the suburbs.
Canberra's National Library cooperates with the national fitness movement by supplying books to 4 play centres in the capital. There are enough volumes to cater for every juvenile taste. Most of the children in the 4 Canberra play centres spend part of each day in reading, gentlest and easiest form of recreation. If they do not have time to complete their absorbing study at the centre, they may take the books home. For those who don't yet know A from B, stories are read by older children. Maybe there's an article on how to cure freckles. The activities of the centre are varied in caring for the mental and physical well-being of the children. At Ainsley Play Centre, boys and girls learn folk dances and are free to participate in any activity offered. Pet parades encourage the love of animals. Dogs are the #1 fancy, everyone an aristocrat of faultless pedigree to its young owner. The kitten and the pup make suspicious introductions. Decentralised, Canberra requires transport to take play centre children to the big swimming pool. Just one of the many play centre activities which encourage the wholesome use of leisure by young Australia.
As early as 1923, when Parliament House was just an outline on the ground, the scene was set for the eventual transference of the Federal Public Service from Melbourne to Canberra. As the government departments transferred here, the population climbed. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, Canberra filled up with young people who had jobs, money, had no one to tell them what to do. It would have been like a large school camp, life in hostels, riding your bike to work or catching the bus home at lunchtime, weekend outings, late night dances, romance down Blossom Lane, all contributed to the community atmosphere. As well as welcoming youth, Canberra held opportunities for all kinds of Australians.
On the banks of the Molonglo River near Canberra is being erected a model camp to house the British workers due in this country shortly. High on the priority of tasks Australia has to tackle is migration. The spacious freedom of Canberra, the tree-lined avenues and the well-laid-out gardens are a far cry from War Act England. Inspection of the project is carried out by the Minister for Migration and Information, Mr. Colwell, and the Minister for the Interior, Mr. Johnson. British workers who for years have been forced to exist upon wartime diets will find food like this as refreshing as the climate in Australia's capital. The establishment will be conducted on the lines of a holiday camp, handy to the Canberra suburbs of Manuka and Kingston. A timely project. At present, 7 million Australians occupy a country of 3 million square miles. We are surrounded by countries teeming with millions. Australia has so few, they so many. It is imperative that we do something about it now.
These years between 1957 and 1965 saw a huge transformation of Canberra. One of the biggest began in 1963, the creation of Lake Burley Griffin. Homes on the floodplain were removed and carried to new locations, some going to Queanbeyan. As the very last car travelled over Lennox Crossing, the barriers went up and work began on the making of the lake. The low-level Scots Crossing, the Kings Avenue Weir and Lennox Crossing had been flooded many times, and so, as preparation for the day the lake would be filled, both of Canberra's main bridges, the Commonwealth Bridge and the Kings Avenue Bridge, were built. The Kings Avenue Bridge was completed first. It took many hot, sweaty months of hard slog and many tons of concrete and steel and piles of dirt. Do you remember that hill that was in front of Parliament House between the National Library and the High Court? Do you wonder what happened to it? It didn't go to waste as it became fill for the approaches to Kings Avenue Bridge. Finally, it was ready to be used. On the 10th of March in 1962, Canberrans thronged both sides of the bridge. Officials and pollies, yes, that's John Overall, head of the NCDC, sharing a joke with the very young Whitlams, Margaret and Gough that is, not the band, had gathered to watch Prime Minister Robert Menzies unlock the bridge. His was the first car over, followed closely by the rest of Canberra.
Attention then turned to the famous old timber bridge.
Within
on
months, the old
Commonwealth
wooden
Avenue,
Commonwealth Bridge, which had served Canberra for almost 40 years, was the next to receive attention.
Preliminary work for the new 6-lane Commonwealth Avenue Bridge was begun as the contractor moved on to the site. Construction went on with great concrete sections being laid on timber trestles as segments of the roadway. Later, the bridge was to be fully stressed to make it self-supporting and the timber substructure removed. A diversion road was built to the west of the bridge and the traffic scurried across the future bed of the lake.
The drought of 1963, while making construction easier, hindered the filling of the lake, but finally it was full. In October 1964, it was dedicated.
Canberra, the nation's capital, achieves new beauty with the magnificent Lake Burley Griffin as its central feature. Ornamental waters were one of the requirements in the worldwide competition for the design of a federal capital in 1912, and this lake was included in the winning design of Walter Burley Griffin. It's fed by the Molonglo River and has a shoreline of 22 miles. Only 5 years after it was decided to proceed with the lake plan, Lake Burley Griffin is ready for inauguration by the Prime Minister, Sir Robert Menzies. Watched by 400 official guests and many local residents, the Prime Minister unveils a plaque at the Regatta Point Exhibition Pavilion. Canberra's lake covers 1,740 acres and varies in width from 1,000 to 4,000 feet. The average depth is 15 feet, but it's 65 feet deep in places, and that makes it just fine for the newly formed sailing clubs. Canberra gets its lovely lake enhancing the beauty of Australia's capital city. And to celebrate the great occasion, there's a fireworks display at night, bursting colour high above the placid waters of Lake Burley Griffin.
With the centre of Canberra filled with water, the designated commerce area of Civic was now markedly defined. But this is not where Canberra's shopping began. Shop till you drop must have come from these early days, as stories abound of Canberrans travelling miles, often on foot, and up to 3 hours, just to find an open shop. As Canberra expanded, so did shopping requirements. As well as large central shopping areas, each suburb, for instance O'Connor, would have its own block of shops, or a group of suburbs would have a larger centre like this one at Dixon. Canberra's retail and commerce life began with the sale of the first commercial lease at Kingston, a few blocks away from the railway head. Competition was fierce. Of course, that's not so surprising, as traditionally businesses near railways flourished. The lease was sold to the general manager, Herbert George Coleman, of the Queanbeyan General Store, J.B. Young Limited. In 1925, J.B. Young Limited, the live firm, Canberra's Universal Providers, was the very first store to open in the FCT, and besides the shop on Jardine Street, the company built 4 homes in 10th Street to house employees. Deliveries were made by horse and cart. A representative went out to canvass orders every week. A twice-weekly bus service brought customers from Ainslie and Acton to Eastlake for the convenience of ladies' shopping. In nearby Manuka, the establishment of the shopping strip took longer. In 1926, the Manuka Arcade was built in the middle of the block on Franklin Street. But the first shop, J.W. Keegan Butchery on Flinders Way, gave little hint of the vibrant mix of boutiques, restaurants and specialty shops to come decades later. On Griffin's plan, there was one central area dedicated to commerce and retail. This was called Civic. When opened by Prime Minister Bruce in 1928, he declined to call the area Civic, finding that the name had nothing of Australia in it and declared a new name should be found. Well, we call it City Centre now. Much more inspiring. In those days, the Melbourne and Sydney buildings were Civic, nothing more. This was the shopping centre for Acton, Ainslie, Reid and Braddon, the entire north side. This view situates Civic in what really are paddocks. It also explains why it was aptly dubbed the White Elephant. The only other building nearby at this time was the police station. The first store to open was Prowse's, a news agency, tobacconist and hairdresser. Prowse's was responsible for some of the first bobs and Marcel waves around town. This was not the first Canberra store that the family had operated, but little Roma couldn't contain her excitement. Later, they also ran the Blue Moon Cafe. The Commonwealth Bank, one of the first leases to be sold, is still in its original position on the corner of Northbourne Avenue and London Circuit. The architect was John Sulman, who had a particular dislike of the stuck-on look of the Australian shop veranda. His design incorporated these beautiful colonnades, making the Melbourne and Sydney buildings unique, certainly in Canberra and possibly Australia. This was also the beginning of Canberra's major north-side thoroughfare, Northbourne Avenue. It's easy to forget that the garden strip, once almost park-like with lawn and trees, was a great spot to eat lunch or meet friends. Today, a constant stream of traffic makes crossing hazardous. As the volume of traffic grew, Canberra's first traffic lights were installed along busy Northbourne Avenue in 1966. The immediate area to the east of the Sydney building was to develop into East Row and Garema Place. Not until 1971 was Garema Place enclosed to become a mall. Monaro Mall, Canberra's first retail shopping mall, cemented Civic's place as the retail and corporate centre of Canberra. To build, in what was considered a wilderness, Australia's first totally enclosed three-tier shopping centre was a very daring undertaking for the NCDC. With all that money being spent showing a strong sense of confidence in the project, businesses were inspired to move in. The grand opening was in 1963, with not just one but three major department stores: David Jones, Marcus Clark and G.J. Coles. There were also 58 specialty shops and a fresh food market. Monaro Mall was described by Prime Minister Menzies as wonderful, immoral, tempting and terribly satisfactory. Almost 10 years after the Monaro Mall opened, a two-storey shopping mall was opened in the south. The Woden Plaza was opened in 1972 by Prime Minister William McMahon, who then took a tour.
This week is a real busy one at the big one. Peter Oldham and his performing puppets will be entertaining the children on the Forum stage at 10:30 a.m. and 1:30 p.m. each day. It's also the last week before the youngsters are back to school, and the stores at the big one are geared up with a whole range of back-to-school specials. Then there's the build-up to Australia Day, with a display on Level 2 by the Institute of Sport, sheep shearing exhibitions on Friday and Saturday, and to cap it all off, the return of Humphrey B. Bear on Friday to give away Australian flags at the big one, Belconnen Mall.
Belconnen Mall opened in 1977. Its 3 floors, connected at the eastern end with a spiral staircase and transparent lift, made it the largest shopping mall in the Southern Hemisphere. Fun and pleasure were 2 commodities that Canberrans found easily, as even back in the 1930s, these were considered somewhat of a priority. Some pollies suggested that it would be a good idea to have live music in the dining room at the Hotel Canberra during meals. Another excellent idea? Some thought not. As the file states, the suggestions made by Senator Fall have at times proved a success in some capital cities, but I am definitely of opinion that they would not be a success financially or otherwise at the Hotel Canberra. Perhaps the real reason was music would interfere with the dinner-time eavesdropping, the easiest way to find out the hottest parliamentary goss. While the government pondered the problem of entertainment, the residents were creating their own. The importance of these entertainments to the community cannot be stressed enough. For instance, when the Bachelors' Quarters at Acton threw the Bachelors' Ball in June 1927, It highlighted the fact that this brilliant affair cast so much credit on the bachelors that they now stand well above par as desirable stock in the marriage market. Duntroon also played a part in these stakes. Amidst its regimental ceremonies, Duntroon would hold balls and other social occasions. The opportunity for matrimony blossomed, and subsequently Canberra's population increased. The Albert Hall, first known as the Assembly Hall, opened on the 10th of March 1928 and was built as the interim town hall. In his speech on opening night, Prime Minister Bruce hoped it would become the centre of musical life in Australia, bringing forth the great liberalising movements of national significance, which played such a great role in the development of the community. The first concert booked was on the 23rd of June 1928. But with a reputation as a big fridge, lack of heating meant that the Albert Hall was never going to live up to its namesake in London. The Albert's life was fairly ordinary, as halls go, until 1954, when it was turned over to be used as a courtroom for the Petrov affair hearings. But what most people might remember best about the Albert were the dances. From its very first days up until the 1970s, weekly dances were held, and with the action in the hall, the lack of heating was never really a problem.
Just as you'll hear the top recording artists in the Record Star Parade on November the 8th at the Albert Hall, Canberra.
Albert Hall's opening was overshadowed to some degree by the arrival on the same day of round-the-world flying pioneer and adventurer Bert Hinkler returning to Australia. Hinkler was invited by the Prime Minister to fly to Canberra to receive a cheque for £2,000. On the 15th of March, declared a half-holiday by the PM, Hinkler landed on the field outside the Currajong Hotel. As he progressed to the reception, Hinkler was mobbed. Fortunately, 20 police had been put on duty, and they were invaluable when on the airmen's arrival, the pent-up enthusiasm of the multitude broke loose and they stormed the landing ground. There was a reception for Hinkler at Parliament House and another one at the Capitol Theatre in Monaco. When the call went out for tenders for the building of this theatre, it was J.C. Williamson's Theatres Limited that won the lease. Already one of the nation's leading theatre chains, it installed Franklin Barrett, an excellent theatre manager of some years' experience, in charge of the capital. This imposing building opened in February 1928 with a stunning royal blue and henna curtain, matching uniforms for staff, a polished oval dancing floor and a refreshment buffet, was Canberra's first theatre. The capital could accommodate both dramatic and operatic performances, and on occasion act as a boxing ring. It also doubled as a cinema 3 nights a week with a children's Saturday matinee. The capital also saw its share of big movie premieres.
300 distinguished guests arrive at the Capitol Theatre, Canberra for a glittering Australian premiere of the film The 10 Commandments. Among members of the diplomatic corps who see the 3.5-hour epic are the Japanese ambassador and his wife. The Prime Minister's wife, Dame Patty Menzies, and the American ambassador, Mr. Sebald, are here too. They're welcomed by the Managing Director of Paramount Studios, Mr. Robert Graham, and his wife, who flew from South America to be present.
The capital was torn down in 1980, but not without great controversy. In 1936, the Civic Theatre in Mort Street was opened. Not so much competition for the capital, it shared the audience and allowed variety and choice for cinema-goers. The Civic was not as palatial as the capital, although the architect Malcolm J. Moyer was the same. It too was often the venue for premieres and special screenings, such as this.
Top-ranking film, The Bridge of the River Kwai, has a colourful premiere at the Civic Theatre, Canberra, with the Prime Minister, Mr. Menzies, one of the official guests. With him is Mr. Roy Bra, Columbia Pictures chief, whose company made the film. Bridge of the River Kwai is a top contender for Academy Award honours, and last week won the British Film Academy Award as the best film in the world for 1957. The screening was held in the distinguished presence of His Excellency the Governor-General, Sir William Slim, and Lady Slim. the premiere of a film that looks all set for a box office bonanza.
Saturday night was the big night at the movies. It was the chance to get together rather than the audience being film buffs. Everyone booked regular seats and the usher might have been your next door neighbour.
Ladies and gentlemen, before putting your car in motion, please replace the speaker on the stand adjacent. Drive forward and to your right. Proceed carefully to the exit. Good evening.
By the 1980s, Canberra had many cinema screens and it had 2 drive-ins. The Sundown opened in 1969 in Narrabundah and the Starlight on the Federal Highway at Watson opened in 1958. For almost 40 years, hundreds of movies were watched through steamy windscreens. To keep pace with the modern audience, new and exciting technology was introduced.
It's a system where the conventional speaker is taken away and a coaxial cable actually connects to the car aerial and we transmit to the car aerial via the car radio. Basically, it's a very simple operation. When the car pulls up at the speaker post, the unit is clipped to the car aerial, the unit is switched on, the car driver turns his 2 accessories and then tunes to our special band, which is 1295.
Canberra's theatre scene was to change dramatically with the building of the Canberra Theatre Complex in the 1960s. It boasted 2 theatres, one seating 1,200, the other more intimate at 300, and was built almost at the foot of City Hill. With its club room and a kitchen for suppers, at last Canberra had a venue that could cater for professional theatre, ranging from its opening night performance by the Australian Ballet to the 1973 Bee Gees concert.
Do you know that your show's the biggest seller ever in the history of the Canberra Theatre? And it's appealed to all age groups from 15 to 50. Why do you think you're so popular to so many people?
Well, I don't think there's any special reason for that. I just don't know. I think maybe because we've spent a long time living here. Yeah. And a lot of people are growing up with what we've done. Things like that and feel a nostalgic value there.
You were born in England.
Yes.
Do you view yourself as Australians or British?
Oh, yes. Well, yes. We were brought up here.
You view yourself as Australians?
The most important part of anybody's life, I think, is when you're from about 8 to 18.
When the most impression is made on you is at that age.
You know, you never forget them.
By 1974, half of Canberra's population was single and under 25. Newcomers were constantly asking, what happens in Canberra after dark? In the 1970s and 80s, the question was easy to answer. Live bands. Canberra had a dynamic live band and pub rock scene. With bands 3 nights a week on Tuesday, Friday and Saturday, the Unibar, with no dress code, was a cheap night out and the place to be in the 1970s. The Denim Disco at the old RSL club in Civic made an attempt to draw the uni crowd, but they remained faithful. Mostly, local bands appeared in a wide range of venues, including the Manuka Football Club, the Captain Cook in Narrabundah, Xanadu at the Croatia Deacon Club, and the Boot and Flogger in Kingston's Green Square. Almost every night of the week there'd be something on somewhere. The Harmony German Club was one of the biggest venues. It also included interstate bands like The Sports, Jojo Zep, and Mondo Rock in the 1980s.
I've got higher purchase, so I'm gone. It's a bushwalk town. Without your love, I peak at sight. Without your love, my wells would dry. Without your love, I know I'd cry. Without your love, I'd surely die. Without your love, without your love, without your love, without your love.
The live music scene continued unchallenged until discos, with their large video screens, continuous music and cheaper running costs took over. Bands did fight back by putting on their own gigs, but they couldn't withstand the onslaught of poker machines. In 1972, the Aquarius Festival was held at the university, where much that was new or unusual found its audience. Today, with a huge range of restaurants, we think nothing of going out to eat, but it hasn't always been the case. In Civic, the Blue Moon Cafe has changed hands several times. In the 1920s, it was operated by the Prowse family, and even before the paint was dry, a family wedding reception was held there. By 1948, the Gerakites family were running it, and it became one of Civic's most popular spots. Its colourful interior, full of good things to eat and drink, was hard to resist. Lumby's was another favourite providing Canberra with its daily coffee hit.
The era of the espresso coffee bar. And in Canberra, these and indeed all eating places have shown remarkable variety and standard in recent years. Much of the credit going to new Australians.
One of Canberra's most famous panoramas is from Red Hill. Almost as famous as the view is the round hilltop restaurant, the Carousel. While enjoying your meal, you could even bump into a pop star. In the 1970s, the Australian fascination with all things past extended to the dining experience. Canberra was not immune and could indulge in Old English theatre restaurants or experience the colonial past.
From morn till night, blow out your kite on boiled beef and carrots. Boiled beef and carrots. Boiled beef and carrots.
Whisk away a century and sample a menu the pioneers would have relished. Underground mutton, great sides of beef, noble puddings. You'll find all this in the atmosphere of the old Canberra Inn. Just a few steps away, forget the formality of the crisp white tablecloth and gleaming silverware to share a barbecue and a drink in one of the city's many beer gardens and bars.
These days, outdoor dining is taken for granted. But up until 1974, Canberra's restaurants were very safely indoors. Eating on the pavement was considered a health risk and no permits could be had. One cafe owner, Gus Peter Silker, took the first step towards outdoor dining. In 1974, Gus, who owned Gus's on Bundas Street, put tables and chairs on the pavement and decorated it with plants. Overnight, his restaurant was vandalised. This is what he had to say about it on the news that night.
No, I still can't see any reason. If I have done something wrong, or they believe I have done something wrong, they can go to court. I would have gone to court, I would have presented my case. And if the court says, look, this is wrong what you do, well, I face the consequences. But there's a difference of opinion. They think I should have asked them, and I think I can't see any reason why to ask them, so the court should make a decision, not the department.
The battle was fought for years. Gus finally received a permit for outdoor eating and was awarded Canberran of the Year in 1978. If you decided to stay home, you could listen to the local radio station. Canberra's first radio station was 2CA. It began broadcasting in November 1931 from the Kingston premises of Jack Ryan's Radio, Electrical and Musical Service on Giles Street.
and receive
2CA filled the airwaves with live local programming between 7:30 and 10 every night. In 1938, 2CA changed hands, Ryan selling out to the Macquarie network.
Capital, home of words, and Crazy Davy gives the station a healthy start.
2CA Canberra calling 2GB Sydney from the Australian capital, Canberra, and on the station platform. What a day, what a glorious day. The sun's shining and it's ready to go right ahead now with those marvelous exercises that pull off so much weight in the right places. So let's get down to business first off, everybody. Down you sit, nice and comfortably. It's the posy bumper. This is the one that takes it off where the arches used to be. When I say lift, lift. When I say bump, bump in a big way. A little music, John. Up you go now. Bump, everybody. Up again now. Bump. Oh, put more into it. Up you go now. Bump. Nice going. One more. Up you go. Let her down. Good work, everybody. Once more. Up you go. Down she comes. That's marvelous. Last one. One on the house. Up she comes. Whamsy. Good business.
Duntroon, Australia's military college in the Federal Capital Territory, joins in with radio to entertain the visitors. This contraption's called a flying fox. And my bonnie flies over the ocean, my bonnie flies over the sea. But evidently the soldiers don't intend to bring back my bonnie to me. Chairman of Directors of 2CA, Mr. R.E. Dennison on the right, leads the broadcasting delegation to Parliament House, where they are welcomed by the Prime Minister, Mr. Lyons, who's done a bit of broadcasting himself in his day.
Well, Mr. Sharp, Mr. Dennison, and ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased indeed on behalf of the Commonwealth Government to extend to you a welcome to Canberra. It seems to me that it's the duty of every Australian who can do so to visit the national capital. Today, I think you're going to help to advertise this capital of ours. You probably think, those of you associated with 2CA, that you'll get some kind of advertisement out of coming, but you're advertising Canberra and we're getting some of our own back through you today. And therefore, on behalf of the government and the people of Canberra too, I bid you a very warm-hearted welcome to the national capital.
New home of 2CA, as modern a radio station as there is in the Commonwealth. And over it towers the steel mast, 231 feet high. There are no stay wires, but still it stays like that. Transmitter and other sections of the technical equipment that makes even a radio uncle sound human. But come away from all that machinery and pass over the microphone. The Prime Minister's going on the air.
Mr. Dennison, Senator Collins, and gentlemen, it is my very great privilege tonight to declare the new 2CA studio open.
You'll always hear the hits of 2CA.
As broadcasting became more sophisticated, the shows on 2CA did too.
It's Garima Airtime.
Up into your delight shop and get a super-duper liquor with the girl on the top.
The 2CA Book Club.
Good evening, listeners. Events move so speedily in Canberra these days.
Canberra is applauding Snow Queen bread.
Makes you glad you're hungry.
Presenting the evening edition of What's On in the District. Now, would you please note, CTC Channel 7 will be telecasting tonight. CTC Channel 7 will be telecasting tonight. This is the only information we have. And would you please stop jamming the switchboard? CTC Channel 7 will be telecasting tonight.
Channel 7 began transmission from their studios on top of Black Mountain on the 2nd of June 1962, bringing television to Canberra. It opened to one of the smallest audiences in the history of television. Capital 7 was one of the first stations to use videotape, outside broadcast vans and adopt data processing in Australia. It was also the first station in Australia built solely for colour. And for 25 years it has remained independent of major networks and interests.
The entertainer taking you away to strange worlds of tomorrow and back through yesterday. Come ride the magic carpet with our Super 7 team. We'll show you places, travel far. You'll meet a Super 7 star. Super 7.
In 1973, communications had grown in priority and a broadcast tower was proposed for Black Mountain. While essential for better broadcasting, it caused much dissension and anger amongst the locals. The Minister for the Capital Territory, Kep Enderby, could see both sides of the story.
I will say I don't think it should be there, but I'll also put the point of view that a lot of people, I don't know how many, think it should. Now, it'll have to be the collective wisdom of Cabinet that'll make a decision on it.
One of the main issues was, why did the tower need to be on Black Mountain? The Senior Assistant Director General of the Postmaster General's Department, Mr. Charles Taylor, had the answer.
Black Mountain is the only mountain that is suitable for television. Television transmitters must remain on Black Mountain. Nobody disputes this. As far as radio telephony is concerned, all the facilities exist on Black Mountain. It is the cheapest place to locate radio telephony, and also, from the point of view of technical operation, it is the best place.
The tower opened in 1980 and quickly became a local landmark. But the anger raised by the tower question was not the only issue that had plagued Canberrans. From this small but disturbing notice in the Queanbeyan Age from a man trying to protect his home, to communists arriving in the 1950s to protest at Parliament House, to 1977 when public servants marched to Parliament House to protest against cuts, there has been an interesting democratic history of tent embassies, cultural protests and marches over the years.
So I gotta get the world off my back somehow, Dave. I'm sitting here thinking about the poems I used to write when I was just a little boy. About that when I grew up, everything would be just fine. Fancy clothes, cigars, driving fast cars. But now I've grown up, and I gotta get the world off of my back. My mind is a beginning to go black.
In 1970, Canberra was the location for The Demonstrator. This was an Australian feature film set against a backdrop of student life and political activism, but telling a story of a son's relationship with his father. Calls for extras ensured that many Canberrans, as well as locations, were featured. Worried that tourists wouldn't have enough to do once here, there was a suggestion that the School of Forestry be open to the public one day a week. Essentially, this was a good idea, but difficulties were foreseen. If it were only a matter of arranging for the caretaker to be on duty right through the holidays, it would not be very serious. But the visit of a very large number, for instance 150 YAL boys and girls, would make it necessary to have 2 people present. Also, what is still more serious, arrangements would require to be made in regard to cleaning the school after each such visitation. In the circumstances, therefore, I cannot recommend that the school be kept open throughout the holidays. Signed, C.E. Lane Poole, Inspector General of Forests. The School of Forestry, located in Yarralumla, was responsible for the development of the FCT's forests, their layout and planting. Headed by Thomas Weston, there was initially much argument with Griffin over where the trees would be planted. Established as Canberra's first industry, it was intended that the pine plantations would provide much-needed income.
New forests clothe the ancient hills round Canberra, a national asset developed at the national capital. For these are valuable pines, grown to make up Australia's serious dearth of softwood. In the past, Australia's forests have been recklessly destroyed. In the future, they will be husbanded and expanded. This national forest at Canberra was planted in 1915. Now the half-grown trees are being thinned out to give the survivors more breathing space, more soil, more room to grow timber. Clear the way for the trees to grow, for our national wealth to grow. The timber they cut in the thinning out process is not wasted. It's hauled to Canberra to be sawn and dressed. Today this forest covers 12,000 acres. When the planting scheme is complete, there will be enough timber for us to cut and mill 500 acres of softwood every year, conserving a national asset.
Under the school's auspices, millions of trees of many species have been planted throughout Canberra, and to this, the city's autumn splendour is due.
In a setting so fair, a city of white was born, with its gardens of blooms and its fair perfumes that greet each sunny morn. Australia's creation, the haunt of a nation, neath azure skies of blue. Wherever you are, be it near or far, Canberra's calling to you.
As Australia's foremost city was planned as a garden city, Canberra developed many parks and playgrounds, but surprisingly had no botanic gardens. Although the site had been selected, the first plantings weren't made until 1949. Prime Minister Gorton officiated at the opening of the Australian National Botanic Gardens in 1970.
Let's take a trip to Melbourne. There's lots to do and true, a welcome waits for you. So let's take a trip to Melbourne.
In the 1920s, a common malaise was Canberra-itis. It was especially prevalent at holiday time, when sufferers would flee town and return to where they'd come from, usually Melbourne. Today's residents still do this. Holidays, long or short, see a mass exodus. There was even a service by the local news to let you know what transport out of town was still available. Though now, the trip isn't only to Melbourne, but a variety of places. Whether you camp, rent or own your own shack, the New South Wales South Coast, Batemans Bay, Browley, Morley Point and many other towns have long been favourite spots. In winter, there are ski fields. Where once cattle grazed, now skiers grace the slopes. Closer to home, there are many favourite spots. The Murrumbidgee River provides Canberrans with numerous sights to enjoy. Casuarina Sands, Pine Island, Point Hut, Uriara Crossing and the infamous Canberra Pool, which is Canberra's legal nude beach, all cater to the widest of tastes. Perhaps the best known is the Cotter. The Cotter was selected as the perfect spot to dam and create Canberra's water supply. Work started on it in 1912. Considered more isolated than Canberra itself, the workers and the families lived there. The 1913 industrial dispute, Canberra's first, resulted amongst other things in the provision of a school for their children. As the dam neared completion in 1915, Walter Burley Griffin decided it would look better if the dam wall was around 20 metres lower than the original 33 metres. At a later stage, in 1951, the extra metres were put back to meet increased demand. The Cotter has always been Canberra's playground. It wasn't unusual for people to camp out there and spend their summer holidays idling under the leafy branches and paddling in the rushing waters. Its beautiful treed avenues, quite splendid in autumn, and its graceful fall of water over the dam are quite striking. In summer, the place to be after school, after work or on any weekend was the Manuka Pool. Situated on Manuka Circle in Griffith, it was completed in 1931. With its 31-metre tiled pool, it replaced for many the Molonglo swimming hole down behind the fire station, the result of the outflow pipe from the power station. The Manuka Pool had its share of famous visitors, like Olympic swimming great Andrew Boy Charlton. Incidentally, he was also captain of the Canberra water polo team in the mid-1930s. 24 years later in 1955, the Canberra Olympic Pool opened in Civic. It won the Sir John Silman Medal for meritorious architecture and was built as the nation geared up enthusiasm for the forthcoming Melbourne Olympics. Now partially an indoor pool, the Olympic was initially built as a series of open-air pools, one large main pool, a children's pool and a deep diving pool. An oasis in a hot, dry summer, it gave relief to all who sought it, from dog paddlers to high divers and everyone in between. Canberra's more frivolous side resulted in its fair share of shows and parades. The very first Canberra Day was celebrated in 1960 and always with a parade. Here was the opportunity for local businesses, community groups, schools and even government departments to strut their stuff. Sport has always played a big part in the life of Canberrans. Apart from golf and football, a range of other sports have engrossed spectators.
In Canberra, some midget cars burned up the track on the Mount Gin circuit, sliding around the corners in a blinding storm of mud, but reaching a fair speed in the short straights. The meeting was put on by the Canberra Motor Club, and 5,000 spectators went along but kept well back because of the mud flying from the roaring wheels of the machines.
Since 1951, cricket brought international focus when the Prime Minister's 11 first played against the visitors. In 1963, the legendary Don Bradman opened the Bradman Pavilion at the Oval. Now, getting back to the other game in town, politics. The 1927 opening of Parliament House was probably the single most important event in Canberra's history. Without the House, nothing further would have been done. While remaining a permanent structure, it was thought of as only provisional, and over the years there were many debates and diverse plans to construct the permanent and modern Parliament building.
We're to build a new permanent Parliament House, and we need it. We can't go on here in this way. The accommodation for ministers, for members, for senators is very bad.
The new and permanent house, the result of another competition, was designed by Mitchell, Gergler and Thorpe. In 1988, the same year as the nation's bicentenary, the house was opened in a ceremony broadcast throughout Australia and watched by millions. It was also the year Prime Minister Bob Hawke advocated self-government for the ACT, and federal government passed the Australian Capital Territory Self-Government Act of 1988. Until then, Canberra was administered by a range of statutory authorities, advisory councils and even a legislative assembly, although in name only with no executive power. The question of self-government had been on the agenda for some time and had many advocates.
But I do believe that Canberra should be having sufficient responsibility in the community to adequately run its own affairs. Now, I think we've matured and grown up as a community. I really doubt whether we are so immature and so lacking in any sense of responsibility that we would more ill manage our affairs than, say, they do in Tasmania.
We've got a different attitude. We feel there should be a development of self-government. There should quite clearly be responsibility by the Assembly for all the administrative responsibilities of Canberra as a community and a city.
But the issue always came down to these three things. That Canberra belonged to the nation and so should be governed by it through the federal government. That the establishment of local government would cost taxpayers, and especially Canberra residents, who would then be required to pay for the upkeep. And that when the question was put to the populace of Canberra in a 1978 referendum,
there are just 3 weeks remaining for ACT residents to decide on the degree of local government that we'll have for what could turn out to be anywhere from the next 5 to the next 25 years. Do we stay as we are, or do we opt for a locally elected administration to handle either the municipal aspects of Canberra or indeed the even broader aspects of a state-like form of government?
The result was a resounding no, thank you. In 1983, as part of its election policies, the Labor government set up a self-government task force and promised self-government to the ACT, despite what the locals wanted. It was time to stand on our own and make the decisions on the issues that affected us the most. In March 1989, the first elections were held for a self-governing ACT Legislative Assembly. The ballot paper was 1 metre wide with 117 candidates to contest 17 seats. 2 months later, results came in and Rosemary Follett became Canberra's first Chief Minister and first female leader of a state or territory. Canberrans were at last responsible for themselves.
In this fair valley rises a fair city, Canberra, capital of the Commonwealth, destined to be a centre of national life and culture. Even the shopping centre is dignified in design, for nothing is allowed to mar the general harmony. Typical of the splendid architecture of the capital is the Australian Institute of Anatomy, for Canberra is already becoming a seat of learning. Here in the National Library are treasured great works of literature and relics of Australian history. Modern homes for Canberra's 10,000, someday it may be 1 million. Modern theatres, modern transport on good roads. The Lodge, the Prime Minister's home. The seat of Australia's government, Parliament House, visited by crowds of tourists. A stately building in a stately city, where man gives a new beauty to the splendid landscape.
Canberra, 1908. After long and bitter argument, this hill-flanked plain was selected in that year as the site of the future federal capital. Canberra, 1942. 34 years have wrought great change, yet consider what vast expansion the next 40 or 50 years may bring. A great city will arise upon the calm beauty of the Canberra plain. Unbelievers may scoff, but it will be so. When the capital wrangle was finally settled, a worldwide competition was conducted for plans for the perfect city. Walter Burley Griffin, Chicago architect, won the prize, and Canberra is being built to the Griffin plan. Today, Canberra grows apace, yet builds carefully towards the ideal of a beautiful city. The high school building is 1/4 mile wide. May it give to the country young minds wider still. Learning must remain democracy's foundation. Mount Stromlo Observatory has contributed much to the world's astronomical knowledge. 2,500 feet above sea level, it houses modern equipment and is under the guidance of foremost scientists. On the slopes of Mount Stromlo, 2.5 million pine trees have been planted under the Commonwealth's reforestation scheme. Canberra's water supply comes from the Cotter River, which is weird at no great distance from the city itself. The populace suffers no water restrictions. The city abounds with many beautiful buildings. The Department of Anatomy is a living memorial to Sir Colin Mackenzie because the research begun by him is carried on. Canberra's public edifices have a charm which is often in contrast to the sometimes ugly solidity and sameness of buildings in many other cities. Parklands abound, and 8 million native and exotic trees and hundreds of thousands of flowering shrubs have been planted. A majestic memorial rises to a great king, in whose reign Canberra was begun and reached maturity. The recently opened War Memorial is an outstanding feature of the landscape. At the nation's heart, there is so much close to the nation's heart. The logbook of the Southern Cross, kept by the late Sir Charles Kingsford Smith and Charles Ulm. The age-stained pages of Cook's own diary on his voyage of discovery. No names loom larger in Australian history than those of Burke and Wills, whose pathetic last message, dig, still remains cut on a tree by Cooper's Creek. Upon those who sit at Canberra, whether in the seats of government or of opposition, devolves a responsibility greater than that carried by any predecessors. In 1942, the freedom, the future, the very life of the nation is at stake. Towards Canberra turn the eyes of young Australia, trusting that the men who sit there will think and act as statesmen and not as politicians. Trusting, too, that despite the mistakes that will occur, they may have the guidance which will help bring this nation through conflict to the destiny towards which it earnestly aspires.
In less than 40 years, Canberra, federal capital of Australia, has grown out of open sheep country. Known as the Garden City, it's the home of many fine buildings. Canberra's climate is specially favourable for flowers, and bulb plants such as these graceful daffodils bloom with all their traditional glory. Thanks to the vision of those who planned this model city, the young people of Canberra enjoy riding in idyllic surroundings. In contrast to other parts of Australia, where there's been wholesale destruction of trees, in Canberra, their cultivation and protection is a matter of civic pride. Literally millions of trees and ornamental shrubs contribute to seasonal blazes of colour. Canberra residents relax on the picturesque golf course laid out in the rolling sheep country in the foothills of the Australian Alps. And wherever there's a lamb, there are bright-eyed youngsters trying to strike up an acquaintance. The annual show of blossom is a fitting tribute to those who built a city of such enduring beauty.
Canberra, the national capital, city of parks and trees and also of tremendous expansion. The old civic centre with its quaint archways and old-style architecture, but alongside are growing modern new stores to serve the rapidly growing population. In the city square, new buildings rise to form a backdrop to the fountains. Private and government building is increasing at a tremendous rate, and the capital's skyline is changing perhaps more than any other city in Australia. Commonwealth offices, huge department stores like this one, new homes, huge blocks of flats like these at Braddon. There is unusual architecture too. This is Noah's Ark Restaurant. The Academy of Science Dome, one of Australia's most unusual buildings. It's difficult to imagine, looking down from Red Hill, that there's a city among the trees. But a city there is, a growing city. And like the capital cities of Australia's states, its skyline is changing fast. This year promises even more changes, more skyscrapers, as Australia's cities continue their multi-million-pound facelift.
Springtime in Canberra isn't the only reason why the national capital is warming up a little. Canberra, the statisticians say, is at last developing a hut. No longer just a transplanted temporary home for public servants, politicians and diplomats. This year, Canberra's population reached the 150,000 mark. Even Parliament House is to become part of the past, with a new permanent building soon to blossom forth on Camp Hill in the city's central triangle. It'll take a place of honour with other prestigious buildings like the National Library, of which Australia and Australians can be proud. Here and there among the modern buildings, one finds monuments to the past, like the old Blundell farmhouse, built before Canberra was ever dreamed of. What does the future hold? A new High Court, a new National Gallery, a new Parliament House, and a population of 500,000 by 1990. But perhaps more important still, for those who live here anyway, Canberra is fast becoming a city that stands by itself in every way.
Canberra, the political hub of Australia, the national capital. This city is considered by many to be one of Australia's most beautiful, for its growth has been completely planned. No building can be erected in Canberra without it fitting into the overall pattern for the national capital development. From small beginnings, the city and its environs are now spreading into the area of the Australian Capital Territory in all directions. New suburbs are springing up, for Canberra is growing faster than any other capital city of Australia. Land developments are commonplace, as housing is top priority. The influx of extra population is taxing the available housing. Many government departments are moving to Canberra, and new office buildings are springing up in many areas. A unique city, Canberra looks towards the next century and a population explosion that will make it a capital worthy of its original concept.
In this fair valley rises a fair city, Canberra, capital of the Commonwealth, destined to be a centre of national life and culture. Even the shopping centre is dignified in design, for nothing is allowed to mar the general harmony. Typical of the splendid architecture of the capital is the Australian Institute of Anatomy, for Canberra is already becoming a seat of learning. Here in the National Library are treasured great works of literature and relics of Australian history. Modern homes for Canberra's 10,000, someday it may be 1,000,000. Modern theatres, modern transport on good roads. The lodge, the Prime Minister's home. The seat of Australia's government, Parliament House, visited by crowds of tourists. A stately building in a stately city, where man gives a new beauty to the splendid landscape.
Canberra, 1908. After long and bitter argument, this hill-flanked plain was selected in that year as the site of the future federal capital. Canberra, 1942. 34 years have wrought great change, yet consider what vast expansion the next 40 or 50 years may bring. A great city will arise upon the calm beauty of the Canberra plain. Unbelievers may scoff, but it will be so. When the capital wrangle was finally settled, a worldwide competition was conducted for plans for the perfect city. Walter Burley Griffin, Chicago architect, won the prize, and Canberra is being built to the Griffin plan. Today, Canberra grows apace, yet builds carefully towards the ideal of a beautiful city. The high school building is 1/4 mile wide. May it give to the country young minds wider still. Learning must remain democracy's foundation. Mount Stromlo Observatory has contributed much to the world's astronomical knowledge. 2,500 feet above sea level, it houses modern equipment and is under the guidance of foremost scientists. On the slopes of Mount Stromlo, 2.5 million pine trees have been planted under the Commonwealth's reforestation scheme. Canberra's water supply comes from the Cotter River, which is weird at no great distance from the city itself. The populace suffers no water restrictions. The city abounds with many beautiful buildings. The Department of Anatomy is a living memorial to Sir Colin Mackenzie, because the research begun by him is carried on. Canberra's public edifices have a charm, which is often in contrast to the sometimes ugly solidity and sameness of buildings in many other cities. Parklands abound, and 8 million native and exotic trees and hundreds of thousands of flowering shrubs have been planted. A majestic memorial rises to a great king, in whose reign Canberra was begun and reached maturity. The recently opened War Memorial is an outstanding feature of the landscape. At the nation's heart, there is so much close to the nation's heart. The logbook of the Southern Cross, kept by the late Sir Charles Kingsford Smith and Charles Ulm. The age-stained pages of Cook's own diary on his voyage of discovery. No names loom larger in Australian history than those of Burke and Wills, whose pathetic last message, dig, still remains cut on a tree by Cooper's Creek. Upon those who sit at Canberra, whether in the seats of government or of opposition, devolves a responsibility greater than that carried by any predecessors. In 1942, the freedom, the future, the very life of the nation is at stake. Towards Canberra turn the eyes of young Australia, trusting that the men who sit there will think and act as statesmen and not as politicians. Trusting, too, that despite the mistakes that will occur, they may have the guidance which will help bring this nation through conflict to the destiny towards which it earnestly aspires.
In less than 40 years, Canberra, federal capital of Australia, has grown out of open sheep country. Known as the Garden City, it's the home of many fine buildings. Canberra's climate is specially favourable for flowers, and bulb plants such as these graceful daffodils bloom with all their traditional glory. Thanks to the vision of those who planned this model city, the young people of Canberra enjoy riding in idyllic surroundings. In contrast to other parts of Australia, where there's been wholesale destruction of trees, in Canberra, their cultivation and protection is a matter of civic pride. Literally millions of trees and ornamental shrubs contribute to seasonal blazes of colour. Canberra residents relax on the picturesque golf course laid out in the rolling sheep country in the foothills of the Australian Alps. And wherever there's a lamb, there are bright-eyed youngsters trying to strike up an acquaintance. The annual show of blossom is a fitting tribute to those who built a city of such enduring beauty.
Canberra, the national capital, city of parks and trees, and also of tremendous expansion. The old civic centre with its quaint archways and old-style architecture, but alongside are growing modern new stores to serve the rapidly growing population. In the city square, new buildings rise to form a backdrop to the fountains. Private and government building is increasing at a tremendous rate, and the capital skyline is changing perhaps more than any other city in Australia. Commonwealth offices, huge department stores like this one, new homes, huge blocks of flats like these at Braddon. There is unusual architecture too. This is Noah's Ark Restaurant. The Academy of Science Dome, one of Australia's most unusual buildings. It's difficult to imagine, looking down from Red Hill, that there's a city among the trees. But a city there is, a growing city. And like the capital cities of Australia's states, its skyline is changing fast. This year promises even more changes, more skyscrapers, as Australia's cities continue their multi-million-pound facelift.
Springtime in Canberra isn't the only reason why the national capital is warming up a little. Canberra, the statisticians say, is at last developing a hut. No longer just a transplanted temporary home for public servants, politicians and diplomats. This year, Canberra's population reached the 150,000 mark. Even Parliament House is to become part of the past, with a new permanent building soon to blossom forth on Camp Hill in the city's central triangle. It'll take a place of honour with other prestigious buildings like the National Library, of which Australia and Australians can be proud. Here and there among the modern buildings, one finds monuments to the past, like the old Blundell farmhouse, built before Canberra was ever dreamed of. What does the future hold? A new High Court, a new National Gallery, a new Parliament House, and a population of 500,000 by 1990. But perhaps more important still, for those who live here anyway, Canberra is fast becoming a city that stands by itself in every way.
Canberra, the political hub of Australia, the national capital. This city is considered by many to be one of Australia's most beautiful, for its growth has been completely planned. No building can be erected in Canberra without it fitting into the overall pattern for the national capital development. From small beginnings, the city and its environs are now spreading into the area of the Australian Capital Territory in all directions. New suburbs are springing up, for Canberra is growing faster than any other capital city of Australia. Land developments are commonplace, as housing is top priority. The influx of extra population is taxing the available housing. Many government departments are moving to Canberra, and new office buildings are springing up in many areas. A unique city, Canberra looks towards the next century and a population explosion that will make it a capital worthy of its original concept.
picturesque city of Canberra, centre of federal government administration and foreign embassies, a city rapidly growing in both size and importance to the nation. Evidence of its development is reflected in modern buildings and a speedily increasing population. In common with other Australian cities, Canberra, through these growing pains, is feeling the stress on its highways, and perhaps more fortunately than elsewhere, is able to plan and construct bridges and roads now which will cope with increasing traffic problems. In the federal capital, practically every family runs at least one car. Consequently, peak periods see a constant flow of vehicles through its many carefully planned intersections. In this testing station, all vehicles are subjected to a series of checks and must be passed before application for registration will be accepted. The tests on specialized equipment usually take only about 10 minutes, and on a busy day, nearly 200 vehicles pass through. Here, correct adjustment of headlight beams is shown. One of a staff of qualified mechanics carries out an underbody inspection. On the brake testing machine, the efficiency of both foot and hand brake is registered. Individual columns representing the brakes on all four wheels are required to be in balance within certain tolerances. Tests which assure mechanical efficiency on the road. Movietone was present at a gathering of Australian Road Safety Council members by well-known artist Scott Pendlebury. Titled Australian Landscape 1962, it is a grim reminder of what is happening somewhere in Australia every day. Safety has been carried into classrooms throughout the Commonwealth. In Canberra, Senior Constable Cooper of the school lecturing section explains correct traffic procedures. He shows how motorists should comply with give-way signs on a dual carriageway. From theory to practice, and as can be seen, vehicles approaching a main highway must wait until the way is clear both left and right. Canberra is attacking its traffic problems to keep down the toll of the road. But in the final analysis, road safety starts with you, driver, rider, or pedestrian.
Welcome to Starlight Driving. Starlight services are designed to make your evening one of complete enjoyment. For any information regarding the use of the speaker or facilities available at the snack bar and the playground, call a ramp attendant. He will be glad to assist in every way. One most important point. When the performance ends, please replace the speaker on its stand before moving. We trust you have a pleasant evening. Thank you.
We've come so far, it seems just yesterday. They chose Canberra to show Australia the way. And everywhere you go, you get the feeling this town is really on its way. People in this town have got the feeling nobody can stop us now. We're here to stay. Capital territory, all eyes are upon us. Capital territory, I'll tell you what they see. We're growing up, growing strong, getting it together, proud to be Capital Territory, ACT.
The picturesque city of Canberra, centre of federal government administration and foreign embassies, a city rapidly growing in both size and importance to the nation. Evidence of its development is reflected in modern buildings and a speedily increasing population. In common with other Australian cities, Canberra, through these growing pains, is feeling the stress on its highways, and perhaps more fortunately than elsewhere, is able to plan and construct bridges and roads now which will cope with increasing traffic problems. In the federal capital, practically every family runs at least one car. Consequently, peak periods see a constant flow of vehicles through its many carefully planned intersections. In this testing station, all vehicles are subjected to a series of checks and must be passed before application for registration will be accepted. The tests on specialized equipment usually take only about 10 minutes, and on a busy day, nearly 200 vehicles pass through. Here, correct adjustment of headlight beams is shown. One of a staff of qualified mechanics carries out an underbody inspection. On the brake testing machine, the efficiency of both foot and handbrake is registered. Individual columns representing the brakes on all four wheels are required to be in balance within certain tolerances. Tests which assure mechanical efficiency on the road. Movietone was present at a gathering of Australian Road Safety Council members by well-known artist Scott Pendlebury. Titled Australian Landscape 1962, it is a grim reminder of what is happening somewhere in Australia every day. Safety has been carried into classrooms throughout the Commonwealth. In Canberra, Senior Constable Cooper of the school lecturing section explains correct traffic procedures. He shows how motorists should comply with give-way signs on a dual carriageway. From theory to practice, and as can be seen, vehicles approaching a main highway must wait until the way is clear both left and right. Canberra is attacking its traffic problems to keep down the toll of the road. But in the final analysis, road safety starts with you, driver, rider, or pedestrian.
Welcome to Starlight Driving. Starlight services are designed to make your evening one of complete enjoyment. For any information regarding the use of the speaker or facilities available at the snack bar and the playground, call a ramp attendant. He will be glad to assist in every way. One most important point. When the performance ends, please replace the speaker on its stand before moving. We trust you have a pleasant evening. Thank you.
We've come so far, it seems just yesterday. They chose Canberra to show Australia the way.